decide in favor of. So we say that states are 100% free to decide monism or dualism. Monism means that as soon as the international legal instrument is enter into force in the international legal order, it will enter into force in the domestic legal order. Okay? And if there is a dualist system, the international treaty will not produce some legal effects in the domestic system, in the internal system, if there is no domestic rule of incorporation. So, what can we say of a state who decides to choose monism, and what can we say of a state who decides to choose dualism from an international law point of view? What is the choice that is more in favor of the development of international law?
Monism?
Yeah, of course, monism. Monism, because the state decides to have a monist system. We say, okay, there is no boundary between my international commitments and my domestic legal order. Means that I will not build a wall between international law and domestic law. International law will be enforced in the domestic legal order as soon as international law enters into force in the international domestic order. Because in dualism or in dualist systems, well, the state always keeps the control on the rules. Because if you have a domestic rule of incorporation, what does it mean? It means that you will have, what does it mean? A rule of incorporation, the domestic rule of incorporation. What is it?
It's a legislative process.
So?
It's like the process to create law, domestic law.
And if we say that there is a treaty that has been ratified by a state, how will the state adopt a domestic rule of incorporation? What is the process?
Well, in case of Cambodia, they created a new law, and by adding some stipulation from the international instrument into the new law.
Yeah, you adopt a new law, a new domestic law. You're right. And as such, well, in Cambodia or anywhere in the world, the state can unilaterally modify its domestic law. It means that the state can decide not to adopt immediately the domestic rule of incorporation, and once the domestic rule of incorporation has been adopted by the state can always modify that rule of incorporation. But the state, of course, cannot by itself modify a treaty unilaterally. Okay? So, if in that case, if the state wants to modify the rule, the state will have to try to negotiate the modification of the treaty. But here, if the state wants to modify the rule, the state only has to modify a domestic rule of incorporation, a domestic rule. Okay? So, of course, the state the dualist state keeps the international rules under control, because it's not the international rule as such that you will implement in the domestic legal order. It's only domestic rules that incorporate international rules. So to modify the rule, you don't have to modify the treaty. You just have to, or it's enough to modify the domestic rule. And of course, a state can always modify the domestic rule unilaterally. Is that okay? So the choice made by the choice made by the state, of course, is not neutral. If the state is very open to international rules, it may choose monism. If the state wants to keep international rules under control, under permanent control, it may decide in favor of dualism. Okay? Yeah.
This one, I just want to refer the agreement, the law on the establishment of extraordinary chamber of Cambodia. This law is come from the agreement between the United Nations and the government of Cambodia. And this one is ratified by the National Assembly in the domestication of the international law and the domestic law. So in this case, can Cambodia unilaterally modify or amend Cambodia itself, or?
Can Cambodia? Well, Cambodia, of course, can modify any rule of domestic legal order of Cambodia. If it's domestic, if the rules are domestic rules, of course they can be modified by the state. But the state may see its international responsibility be engaged by doing this if the modification of the rules, of the domestic rules, creates a violation of some international commitments, of some international obligations of the state. But in that case, as the international law rule cannot be invoked directly before a domestic tribunal, the only possible proceedings may be before an international tribunal. Okay? Because if you have a strict dualist system, there are no international rules applicable in the domestic legal system. What is applicable? It's only domestic rules. Domestic rules that may be the copy of international law rules or international rules of law, but it's not as such international rules. It's a domestic rule which incorporates into the domestic legal order a rule of international law. Okay? So, of course, the choice in favor of monism or dualism is not neutral for state. So that's the theoretical presentation. We will go back on this later. The second point will be the domestic application of international treaties in France. We will see some foreign examples later, but first we will make a focus on the French system, as you will receive a French diploma. I wish you can understand what is the situation in France. Well, in France, the system has been decided in 1958. So 1958, with the Constitution, the adoption of the Constitution of the Fifth Republic. Okay, Constitution of the Fifth Republic. So France has the same Constitution since 1958. Well, it has been revised many times, but well, we are still under the authority of the Constitution of the Fifth Republic of 1958. And several provisions of this Constitution refer to or deal with international law. But the main provision is Article 55. Yeah. So Article 55 that states that treaties or agreements duly ratified or approved shall, upon publication, prevail over acts of Parliament, subject with respect to each agreement or treaty to its application by the other party. Okay? So, this provision, which has not been revised in the last 61 years, this provision has generated many disputes, or very important disputes, before French tribunals. So, what do you think? What do you think a domestic tribunal may do, or has to do, or should do when an individual invokes before that domestic tribunal the benefit of an international treaty? So let's say that there is a dispute. Let's imagine a dispute. I don't know, Mr. X versus the state, okay, versus France, before a domestic tribunal. And let's say that Mr. X claims the benefit of the provision of an international treaty. What should the dispute claim? Mr. X claims the benefit of the treaty, of the provision of the treaty. What should the judge, the French judge, do when someone comes before the tribunal and says, well, I want you to decide that France has not respected its international obligations in favor of Mr. X or any other claim. What do you think that the judge has to do regarding Article 55? If you read Article 55, what are the evidence? What are what could be or should be the steps of the rezoning of the tribunal or of the domestic judges? Well, or let's a more precise example. Let's say that the benefit of the treaty should be, although it does exist, requirement at the right to retire at 60, okay, is in a treaty. And if the state says there is a domestic rule that does not allow the retirement, no retirement before 65. Okay, so here we have two different rules. If we say that Mr. X should benefit from the treaty, then he has the right to retire at 60. But if we say that the Mr. X should be or should respect the domestic rule, then there can be no retirement before 65. Okay, so let's say that state says, okay, you cannot retire before 65, and the individual says, but under the treaty, I have the right to retire at 60. Okay, so we see that if we consider that the treaty has to apply, then the right to retire at 60. If the domestic rule has to apply, then there's no retirement before 65. So what should do the French tribunal in such a situation?
I think the French tribunal will have to decide in favor of the claim by the Mr. A. Because based on the Constitution, the treaty prevails the act of the Parliament, and I think the domestic law, is established by the act of the Parliament.
Yeah, always.
Not always.
So if it's not always, well, the answer is not always. You're right. But what are the elements that have to be examined by the judge? What are the steps of the reasoning? What are the conditions that have to be respected and fulfilled? So, well, let's say that for 5 minutes that you are a French judge. You have Mr. X in front of you, and you have the French administration in front of you. So there's a disagreement between Mr. X and the administration. What do you do? And what are the conditions included in Article 55 that have to be checked by the domestic tribunal?
Firstly, the treaty is already approved or ratified.
Yeah.
And secondly, whether it's already published or not.
Yeah. And no, you're right. Okay. First, whether the treaty has been duly ratified or approved. Second, whether the treaty has been published or not. And third, yes, whether the agreement is applied or receives application by the other party. So you have three conditions that are mentioned in Article 55. The treaty will prevail over acts of Parliament, but only if the treaty has been duly ratified or approved, only if the treaty has been published, and only if the treaty is applied or receives application by the other party. So let's see how we do that in practice. Well, the first element is the question of the ratification or approval of the treaty. There are two provisions in the French Constitution regarding the ratification and the approval of treaties. Article 52 states that the President of the Republic shall negotiate and ratify treaties. He shall be informed of any negotiations or the conclusion of an international agreement not subject to ratification. This is what we mentioned last week. There are two kinds of treaties. The treaties negotiated or concluded in a simplified form that will be binding on states upon the signing of the treaty, and the treaty concluded in a solemn form that require ratification to entry into force. So, first, well, what is important here is only the first sentence. So, the President of the Republic shall negotiate and ratify treaties. And the second provision is Article 53. So it's an exception to Article 52, stating that these treaties, trade agreements, treaties or agreements relating to international organization, those committing the finances of the state, those modifying provisions which are the preserve of state law, means law adopted by the legislative body, those relating to the status of person, exchanging or acquiring of territory, may be ratified or approved only by an act of the Parliament. They shall not take effect until such ratification or approval has been secured, and no ceding, exchanging, or acquiring of territory shall be made without the consent of the population concerned. Means that for some treaties, which are supposed to be the most important ones, these treaties, relating to international organizations, etc., well, the President cannot decide by himself to ratify or not the treaty. The Parliament is involved in the procedure, and you need the approval of the Parliament to ratify the treaty. That's basically what we've seen when we mentioned last week basically the same question here. In the US, the ratification process involves the Senate, so a legislative body, to control what has been done by the President of the United States. Well, it's the same here. For some treaties, not all treaties, but for some treaties, you need ratification approved by an act of the Parliament. Okay, so if we go back to Article 55, so the first thing the French judge has to do is to check if the treaty has been duly ratified. So it means that if the treaty has not been duly ratified, it cannot prevail over acts of Parliament. So if the treaty has not been duly ratified, then Mr. X cannot claim the benefit of the treaty. Okay? But if it has been duly ratified, it will prevail over the domestic rule, and then Mr. X can claim the benefit of the early retirement at the age of 60. Okay? So, depending on the ratification process and the conformity of the ratification process to the Constitution, you will benefit from the international rule, or you will not benefit from the international rule. Well, this provision seems clear on this question, but the French Conseil d'État so the French Conseil d'État, State Council, if you want. The French Conseil d'État is it is the high court of the administrative litigations. Okay, it does exist in Cambodia as well.
There is no actual administrative litigation in Cambodia.
Okay, there's no distinction between.
But the constitution states that the court of Cambodia cover all litigation, all
Okay.
type of litigation, including
Administrative. Okay, well, okay. So in France, we have two separate judicial systems. One for private litigation and one for administrative litigation. And well, at the top of the administrative litigation system, there is the Conseil d'État. Okay, so it's the high court of for administrative litigations. Well, and the Conseil d'État said that he did not have jurisdiction to check if the treaty has been duly ratified or not. Okay? So the Conseil d'État or during a very long period of time said that he did not have jurisdiction to check if the treaty has been duly ratified or not. He said that the ratification process was a political process, and as such, there cannot be a legal control on such a political process. And so, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and the biggest part of the 90s, the Conseil d'État refused to check if a treaty has been duly ratified or not. The opinion of the Conseil d'État was treaty has been ratified, so I can go on the second condition. So it was only checking if the treaty has been ratified. If there is an act of ratification, then the treaty has been ratified. And the Conseil d'État refused to check if this has been respected. So we could have, I don't know, in the 60s or in the 70s, some situations where the treaty may be a trade agreement which may have been ratified only by the President of the Republic without the approval of an act of Parliament, without the approval of the legislative body. Well, according to the French Conseil d'État, it was not a problem. The treaty has been ratified, whatever the process of ratification was. The treaty does exist, and we can move on to the second condition, which is the question of publication. This changed in, in 1998, with a judgment from the Conseil d'État in the case of the Société du Parc d'Activité Commune de Blotzheim. So it's Commune de Blotzheim, it's a city in the eastern part of France. And in this case, in 1998, for the very first time, the Conseil d'État accepted to check if there's only one term actually, decided to check if the ratification respected the provision of Article 53. And if the ratification was not regularly conducted, then the treaty cannot be invoked before domestic tribunals. Okay? So, this is the first time that the condition of the due ratification or approval of the treaty has been really checked by the French judge. So, first, Mr. X has to, if Mr. X wants to benefit of the right to retire at the age of 60, he has to prove that the treaty has been duly ratified. If it has not been duly ratified, it's the domestic rule that will for sure prevail over the treaty.